Kate Raworth to the stage. Kate Raworth is, among many things, I think very importantly, she's a mother of twins. So she knows very well that things don't grow forever. Please welcome Kate Raworth.
I don't need that. I think you do need this. Do I? Do I need this as well? Oh, but I need my hands. Okay, well, oh my God. Okay, hello. Do I really need this? Can somebody official with technology tell me, yes, I have to hold this for some purpose? Yes? Okay, right. Well, I'm delighted to be here. Yeah, I didn't bring any donuts with me. But listen, health warning, don't eat donuts, okay? They're not good for you. And I'm sorry to bring junk food in the room, but I'm going to introduce you to the only donut that actually might turn out to be good for us, but you don't have to eat it. Only intellectually, but not actually into your stomach. So let me kick off by letting you know who I am, because whenever I see somebody standing up on a stage, I always think, well, where are you coming from? And what's the mindset you learned in life? And what are the experience that you have in life? Because only then can I begin to understand what you're talking about. So let me tell you a little bit about who I am. I was a teenager of the 1980s. I grew up seeing a hole in the ozone layer. I saw a famine in Ethiopia. I'm sure many of you remember these. I saw a Exxon Valdez oil tanker spewing oil out into Alaska. And so by the end of the 1980s, I knew one thing, which is I wanted to help change the world. Who doesn't want to do that? And so I thought the best thing to do was to equip myself with the mother tongue of public policy, to learn economics. And then I would actually be able to use this tool to help bring about the world that I believe we all want. So off I went to university to study economics. Oh, my clicker's not working. Here we go, hang on. There we go. Here's me on my way to university, me reading my very first economics textbook, excitedly. But I found at university that the economic theories I was taught left me frustrated and disappointed, because the issues that I cared most about, like the integrity of the living planet on which we depend, and social justice, I felt these were pushed to the margins of the theory. You had to hunt them out if that's what you wanted to focus on. So after 4 years of studying economics, I walked away from academic economics, and I immersed myself in the real world economy of real world challenges. I spent 3 years working in the villages of Zanzibar. I was an economist in the Ministry of Trade and Industry of Zanzibar, working with barefoot entrepreneurs who had to survive and raise their families with nothing but the forest, the community, and their wits. I then spent 4 years working at the United Nations as an economist at the Human Development Report, coming up with a new vision of what human development means as part of that program of reimagining the future of what we think development is. Then I spent a decade working with Oxfam, known here as Novib, and we campaigned for workers' rights in global supply chains with supermarkets and clothing companies. We campaigned to show that climate change is a social justice issue because it impacts on the lives of the very poorest in the world. And then, yes, I became a mother of twins. And I understood gender politics and the relationship between the household and the workplace in a way that I never got until I was changing 2 nappies at the same time. Like, this really drove it home. And through all of these experiences, all of which are economic experiences, I realized that what I'd been doing for all these years was fighting back against what I felt were the blind spots and the blank spaces and the silences in the mainstream economics education I'd had. And so I left my job at Oxfam. And I've spent the last 5 years teaching at the Environmental Change Institute in Oxford, but also diving into all the alternative economic ideas that have been around for decades. Ecological economics, feminist economics, institutional, behavioral, complexity economics, which are replete with amazing ideas, to bring them together and say, what happens when we put these ideas on one page, when they dance together on one page? Because through all of this, I was inspired by the quote of one brilliant American inventor from the last century, Buckminster Fuller. And he said, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And I agree, sometimes the best form of protest is to propose something new. And sometimes that model that we build It might be a new business, but it also might just be a new picture, because pictures are incredibly powerful. They go into the back of our minds and sit in the visual cortex for decades, long after the words and the diagrams, or the words and the equations have faded. See, Copernicus knew the power of pictures. In the 1500s, he was watching the motion of the planets, and he knew that Ptolemy over here, who had Earth unmoving at the center of the known universe, he knew that Ptolemy had it all wrong. But Copernicus waited till he was on his deathbed before he dared to publish his own alternative. Because he knew that by putting the sun, not Earth, at the center of the known universe, he was challenging papal authority, questioning church power, and upending man's sense of self, our place in the universe. I think it's time for our own Copernican revolution, not in terms of where we are in the universe, but something much closer to home. Something about on what our well-being depends and our understanding of what human well-being is. Because you see, I think we're still in the Ptolemaic era when it comes to thinking about the economy. The line, the shape of progress that we've been told for nearly a century is this ever-rising line of GDP. And this is the story of GDP back from the 1870s through to now, forecast into the future. Well, I was born in 1970. I'll save you the maths. I'm 47. I was born in 1970. And since I was born, the global economy has quadrupled in size. And it's forecast, if forecasts are right, to more than quadruple again by 2050. Of course, this has brought prosperity and well-being to millions, billions of people who never had it before. It's improved many, many people's lives. But this story does not come without its complications. Because today we have an economy that's deeply divisive. 1% of people in the world own half of the world's wealth. I'll be honest with you, I can't actually get my head around that. But that comes from Forbes magazine. And we have an economy that is running down the living planet on which we all fundamentally depend. Of course, our politicians know it. And so they're locked into talking about growth. But now when they talk about growth, they add adjectives to describe it. I call it a game of growth bingo. And I listen out for the adjectives they're going to add. Do you want sustained growth or sustainable growth, green growth, smart growth, inclusive growth, good growth, balanced growth, lasting growth, clean growth? You can have any kind of growth you want, but as long as you want growth. I take this as a sign of optimism. The fact that politicians have to add so many adjectives in front of this word that is supposed to tell us what progress looks like. It's clearly an idea that is ripe to fall and is ready to be replaced by something else. So what could we replace it with? And yes, some of these faces have already changed, but even when the faces change, the story doesn't. Actually, one man here, Donald Trump, he doesn't add any of these adjectives. He's just for growth. He's actually harking back to the 1960s when Kennedy was for growth. The world's got a lot more complicated, and we know a lot more since then, so you can't just be for growth. So how could we put a new compass in the hands of these politicians who are looking for something? I think it's time for that new compass. And I think it's so simple to describe what human well-being depends upon that I've got it in my pockets. And since I have to hold a microphone, let me just see, I'm going to sit down for a minute. So, I don't like that for the feedback. In my pocket. Well, let me ask you first. What do you think human well-being depends upon? Shout it out.
Love.
Love.
Health.
Health.
Nature.
Nature. Food.
Art.
Wine? Did I hear wine? Education.
Friendship. Cooperation.
Connection. Community. Safety. Order. Order. Yeah, it does.
Harmony.
Harmony. What? Trust. Peace. Together. Sharing. Ah, you got it. You guys, you're all good guys. You're saying all the right things. So let me show you. I've got it in my pocket. So one thing it depends upon. The bean. Food, right? It's one of the first things that several people said. Food. We all need food. And water. And housing. And energy. And mobility. Electricity. healthcare, education, the basic human rights that have been enshrined in international law since 1948. Yes, the basis of human sustenance. This is the bit that gets hard with the microphone. But we also need this little blue marble, the planet on which we depend. Its stability, its integrity. We need a stable climate, a protective ozone layer, fertile soil, ample biodiversity and abundant water. Because we can't have one without the other. Let me see if I can see. If we want food, we need a stable climate and fertile soil. If we want health, we need an ozone layer. If we want fresh water every day, we need healthy oceans and lakes. These two things are deeply intertwined. We can't have one without the other. Now, what would that look like in a picture? Yes, silly though it sounds, it looks like a donut. The only one that's actually good for us. So let me tell you about this donut. In the hole in the middle is a place where people are falling short on life's essentials. People don't have enough food, health, education, all those things we named. That's a shortfall, and we want to get everybody in the world out of that hole so that everybody's over this social foundation. So every human being can lead a life of dignity and opportunity and community. And these 12 dimensions inside the donut, I crowdsourced them from the world's governments. They are the social priorities set out in the Global Sustainable Development Goals. So they're the most contemporary statement of what all the governments in the world have agreed that every person has a claim to. We want to get everybody out of the hole, but we also can't overshoot the outside of this donut, because there we start to put so much pressure on our extraordinary, unique, living planet that we begin to kick it out of balance. We cause climate breakdown, acidify the oceans, destroy biodiversity, convert the land surface for human use, pollute waterways. And these 9 dimensions on the outside, these are the global, the planetary boundaries that were first drawn up in 2009 by Earth system scientists led by Johan Rockström and Will Steffen. They looked at the last 100,000 years of life on Earth and saw that just in the last 11 or 12,000, the temperature on Earth has been remarkably benevolent and stable for humanity. And they asked, what is it about this last 12,000 years in which humanity discovered agriculture, in which we created all civilizations? It's our home sweet home. So what is it about this era? And they identified 9 critical Earth system processes that they believe are holding the Earth in balance, just as in the health of any one of us. Our body temperature, the amount of water, the amount of oxygen, the amount of fat and sugar, our muscles, our skeleton, hold our body in a balance that we call health. And so they drew up health for the planetary body and said we can't overshoot too much pressure on any of these dimensions. Otherwise, we risk kicking Earth out of balance and destroying those life-supporting systems on which we all fundamentally depend. So the simplest way I can say it is that this is a compass for the 21st century, a compass that aims to meet the needs of all within the means of the planet. And I think this could indeed be a compass that guides us. But if it's a compass, you obviously want to know where the needles are pointing. A compass is useless without its needles. So here's where the needles are pointing. And the red shows how we're falling short on people's rights and how we're overshooting our pressure on the planet. So here on food, that little wedge on food is coming 11% of the way towards the middle of the circle, because 11% of people don't have enough food to eat every day. On water, there are 2 indicators. 9% of people don't have enough clean water, and 1 person in 3 worldwide doesn't have access to what we would call a toilet. But on every one of these social foundation dimensions, you can see that millions or billions of people in countries rich and poor are falling short on life's essentials. And yet, we've already overshot at least 4 of these planetary boundaries. The limit on climate change is set at 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide. If you know the campaigning organization by Bill McKibben, 350.org, it's that same 350. In April last year, we went over 410 parts per million, so we're way over on climate, but massively over on nitrogen and phosphorus use as well. Fertilizers that don't get taken up by plants, but leach out into lakes and rivers and kill off the life in that water. Massively over on biodiversity loss, 10 times the species loss that one would expect if we weren't destroying the ecosystems around us. Over on converting too much land of the Earth's surface into human use. And when it comes to chemical pollution and air pollution, we don't even know where we are globally. So this is a picture. It's not an easy one, but this is a picture of the state of humanity in our planetary home at the beginning of the 21st century. And I think this is the picture that should guide us. It's our generational challenge. No generation before us saw this image. I think this is what our children and their children will judge us on. Not for Trump, not even for Brexit, but for this. Will we be the generation that begins to turn this story around? Will we begin, for the first time in human history, to start to meet the needs of all people, but do so within the means of the planet? And of course, the question is, are we going to take that challenge on? And are we going to leave that legacy? Will we want to be remembered by history as a generation that actually started putting humanity on track for this? Well, of course, many, many things need to change in the world if we're going to turn this story around. One of my passions is changing economics education, because I believe that what students like myself were taught 25 years ago, but even students today, the education they're being taught is not going to equip them to take on the scale of this challenge. But we need change in many other places too. And what really delights me is when I get contacted by people who've just taken this idea up and are already putting it into practice. So some urban designers in Stockholm contacted me last year and they said, we're developing a new suburb of Stockholm. It's about 15 minutes by train from downtown Stockholm. This area under the motorway there, there's a train station here that's never been opened and is waiting for a new suburb. So they're designing this totally new suburb of Stockholm. And they've said, well, we're using your donut. They've got it on the table there. We're using it as a visioning aspiration. How could we develop a new suburb of our city that actually meets the needs of all its residents, their housing, food, water, health, education, transport, but does so within the means of the ecosystem and the planet where it's situated? In the fastest growing town in KwaZulu-Natal, Kokstad, in 2012, the municipality sat down with some of the community groups and the town's youth, and they realized that their town was just growing in a sprawling, unplanned way. And they wanted to come up with a new vision for the town. And so they used the donut to envision a future of Kokstad which would be thriving, working with and within the means of the planet, generating jobs and housing and well-being for everybody there. And they developed their own version of the donut. They came up with their own local metrics for what would it mean to do this here. And my favorite thing about it was that the youth of the town said, when it comes to the social side, we have to add one metric. You can see they added fun. It has to be fun transforming your economy, right? You guys know that. It has to be fun making this change. I was really honored last December to discover that this gentleman who's the director of China's renewable energy strategy, when he's launching the renewable energy strategy here in Beijing, but also around the world, the second slide that he shows in his presentation is the donut. I've never had contact with him before. He found it, and he saw that this spoke to the vision that he wanted to tell. And right next to it is a quote from President Xi Jinping saying that we have to create harmony between man and nature and man and society. So some people who have a big role in transforming major economies are using this as a top-level vision to explain the strategy they're following. But one question I love to ask, and I'm bringing it here because many of you are involved in enterprise, is to sit with companies, and I show them this picture and I say, imagine if every company in the world drew up its corporate strategy seated at this table and asked itself, does the way that we make a profit help actually meet people's needs and meet the needs of all? And are we doing so by bringing humanity back within the means of the planet? Or, let's be honest with ourselves, are we actually making a profit kind of pushing on the edge of people's rights and undermining their wages and, you know, undermining union rights and exploiting planetary resources and pushing us over the planet? Because last century's business models were essentially based on that. I've been fascinated by the responses I've heard from so many different kinds of companies when I've presented them with the donut diagram. And there are 5 basic responses that I've heard coming back from companies. So the first one is the oldest. Do nothing. Well, it's very sorry, this picture you show of the donut. But you know, as Milton Friedman said in the 1970s, the business of business is business. And our job is to turn a profit. So everything we're doing is nearly legal. And until governments change the regulations, we're just going to keep going. That doesn't work anymore. So we have to go one step up. So the first step up is to do what pays. Well, if we cut our carbon emissions, we'll make cost savings, so we'll do that. If we get green endorsement and certification, we might get access to a niche consumer market, so we'll do that. These are the right steps to take, but far too incremental and for a very narrow reason, still focused on maximizing the returns to the company. We'll never get there in time if we move at such an incremental pace. So the third step up is more ambitious. It's to do our fair share. And you hear this in terms of science-based targets. Companies say, well, in our country, the government's committed to cutting global carbon emissions by our national carbon emissions by 20% by 2020. So we'll do that. We take on our fair share of that national commitment, which is an ambition, certainly beyond here, because you're beginning to be in line with what's required. But there's a danger to this fair share approach, because if any of you, well, I'm sure many of you have, been at dinner with a large group of friends in a restaurant, and then someone says, well, let's all just chip in our fair share of the bill. You don't want to be the person handing the money to the waiter at the end, because it so often doesn't add up. There's a real danger that we fall short when it comes to our fair share, especially when you think of the global climate change negotiations. Countries are saying, well, you're not putting in your fair share, so I'm not putting in my fair share till you put yours in. It's not going to get us there. And also, there's a real danger that this fair shareism turns from what is my fair share to contribute to what is my fair share to take. I've been struck by the number of major oil and gas companies, particularly, who come up to me after talks and say, this is very interesting. This climate change red wedge you show, this global carbon budget, how much of that is ours? To which the answer has to be none of it. None of it belongs to you. We can no longer afford to hand away the right to pollute to companies. So I think we have to go beyond this notion of fair shares. So let's get more ambitious, beginning to get really ambitious now. Do mission zero. We're going to be net carbon zero, right? We're going to have no net carbon emissions in our supply chain. It is transformational, because the 20th century industrial model was focused on taking Earth's materials, making them into something we want, and then throwing away the pollution. It was degenerative by design. So this is transformational. But, as the designer Bill Madonna would say, if you can do no harm, why not break through the ceiling of your imagination and actually do good, go net positive, and really reinvent the business model? And here I would call this being generative. So this is the full spectrum of responses that I see from companies. And the point is not, where are you right now? The point is, where are you going? Have you gone to, let's do our fair share, so that's kind of dealt with, we don't have to worry about that anymore? Or actually, are you on the way to something much more transformational? Where are you headed in this direction? Let me tell you in examples what I mean by be generative, so that we would actually indeed bring ourselves within the donut. I think we need to put 2 design principles at the heart of our economies and economic policy making, but also at the heart of what business does. And that is to be distributive by design and be regenerative by design. So let me talk a little bit about each of them. To be distributive by design, I'd say it in terms of business, it means ensuring that value that is created is shared far more equitably with those who help to co-create it. And there are many ways of doing this. This is a supermarket called Waitrose, or John Lewis in the UK, very well known, highly respected, major supermarket. It is owned by its employees. It has 17,000 people who work for it. All of them are called partners. And when we order our groceries from this shop, partly because I share their values. And when I was at home writing my book, I would always wait for the delivery man to bring the groceries. I'd come running down and get in a conversation, and I'd say, what does it mean to you? Or does it mean anything particular to be working as a partner? And they would put the boxes down and say, this means a lot to me. I'm not just a delivery man at the end of a supply chain. I'm a partner in this organization. And if I see things happening in the supply chain that I think could be changed, I can take that back to my manager. And there was a real pride. And no wonder, because everybody gets a 17% share of the profit take. So an employee-owned company can be a major company. much more distributive of the value that everybody in that company helps to create. What about through the supply chain? Familiar, ethical supply chains in which supermarkets or clothing companies don't just extract the maximum value they can from their suppliers, but work together with them on long-term relationships and respect the purchasing practices, ensuring that the delivery times, the lead times, the flexibility, the price paid enables those suppliers to pay their workers a decent living wage. What about in terms of the ownership of the enterprise itself? Here's a community-owned company generating electricity in Cornwall in the UK, but we can take it away from a field and put solar panels on the roof of every house. What about enterprises that think about selling distributively owned energy systems to households? How can we make that distributed so that the owners of the technology themselves are benefiting from that technology? And this one, ooh, clicker doesn't want to work. Oh yeah, I know this looks like a rock concert, but it's not. This is a software development conference. Does anybody here in the room use a software called Drupal? Oh, a Drupal user. So Drupal is a software that's used to design websites, and it's open source, which means that exactly how that software is made is available for anybody to see, but also all of its users can contribute to improving it. And every year they have a conference, all the users get together and work on developing new parts of that software. Most companies would be so envious of having such a big research and development team. But the passion of these people, they come together because they all have a stake in the software. So this is open source intellectual property rather than the old design of patents and copyrights. So we can create enterprises that are far more distributive of the value created in with suppliers and in terms of intellectual property. What about regenerative by design? This diagram shows us through the middle of it runs the degenerative linear 20th century economy in which we take Earth's materials, make them into stuff we want, use it for a while, and then throw it away. And that action cuts against the cycles of the living Earth. It pushes us over planetary boundaries. We take from Earth's sources and spew waste into her sinks. We have to bend those arrows around and create a circular or cyclical economy that never uses resources up, but always uses them again and again. And we have both the biological, this is just us getting out of the way and letting nature do what she's done for billions of years, which is regenerate carbon, water, nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen, again and again, the building blocks of life. You know, putting our food waste in a separate bin at the simplest level. But also here, the technical materials, meaning anything that's human-made from this little clicker. If it breaks, I should be able to open it and replace just one little part. Rather than throw the whole thing away, its parts should be usable again and again and again, which means we need an economy that runs on sunlight, that is modular by design, and I believe it needs to be open source by design, so that whoever's hands this clicker ends up in is able to tell what this material is made of, and therefore can re-enter it into an ecosystem of resource use. Some examples. Here's a slum in Kenya, one of those places where there were no toilets, except now there are, because a small enterprise called Sanergy started installing toilets so that for the first time, communities here have access to a toilet. There is toilet paper, water, soap, it's clean. This is the beginning of dignity, but also health and safety in a community. Every day the waste is collected, it's manured, it's turned into organic compost, which is then sold to local farmers, nutrifying the soil. So essentially what this enterprise does is close the nitrogen loop and recycles that material, that essential resource. So it's not flowing out into the waste in the sea, but it's also having massive impacts on human health, and it's distributive by design because it's owned as little franchises. So individuals set up an enterprise in running these toilets, collecting the waste. So it creates jobs throughout the community too. Another example from the other end of human experience, a Swedish company called Houdini, who make high-end sportswear. And if you were to wear Houdini clothes, you'd know that they were only made from wool and tencel, which are organic fibers which can decompose. They even decomposed some of their clothes, turned it back into soil, grew vegetables in it, and then served it as dinner to some of their top clients to say, you're now eating your former ski wear. But also they use recycled polyester, recycled nylons, so that they create circular loops of material use that's going around and around. They also look out for labor supply issues, so aim to be a distributive employer, paying a living wage throughout the supply chain. Now, Houdini clothing is expensive. Of course it's expensive, just as it was expensive in the 1970s to put a solar panel on your roof. But once this becomes the norm, not the exception, once you get an ecosystem of resource use, the costs come down for everybody and it becomes irresistible and it becomes market logic. Last example, if you were to buy a car from Open Motors, it would arrive in a flat pack IKEA style. And if you knew what you were doing, you could assemble it in an hour. But if you didn't know what you were doing, you could take it to somebody who did, because the hardware of that car is open source. Anybody can go on the internet and see exactly how it's made, exactly how it's assembled, which means anybody can set up a shop where we assemble these cars, but also we customize them and we improve them, and it can be turned into all sorts of different uses. This kind of open source distributive manufacturing, I think, is the beginnings of the 21st century model of manufacturing, where we don't have economies of scale in one place. I live in Oxford, and all the minis in the world are created, fully formed in Oxford, and then shipped across the world. Now, this is a new future, where the components are shipped, but the distributed understanding of how to contribute to that is everywhere. And it can be turned into a locally relevant, specific product. So customization going on everywhere. So I believe if we're going to get into the donut, we need enterprises that are distributive by design, that share value far more equitably with all who help co-create it, and are regenerative by design, working with and within the cycles of the living world. In fact, I think we're in the middle of a great transformation, a psychological drama that's going on at the heart of business. Because in the 20th century, the one question that seemed to drive so much business was simply, how much financial value can we extract from this? And you hear it at the heart of the mainstream finance sector. But all the people who created those products, from the toilets in Kenya to the Open Motors, to the Houdini sportswear, to the solar-paneled community, asking a very different question. And whenever I speak to enlightened entrepreneurs, product designers, CEOs, they're coming from somewhere different, and underlying it is one driving question. How many benefits can we layer into the way we design this thing? What else could this do? How else could this give back to the community? What else could we do to return these materials to the environment? How else could we cut carbon emissions? How else could we make this a generative design? And the really interesting question is, what is it that makes the difference between companies that are still asking the financial driving question versus the one that are looking for the multiple benefit? And here I would say we need corporate psychotherapy. You know, when people go to a psychotherapist, they might say, you know, I need a psychotherapist. I have relationships with really tricky people, and you need to help me handle them. And actually, the more psychotherapy you do, you realize, oh, it's not them. It's me. And I need to transform. I need to work on myself. So let's think about corporate psychotherapy, because many companies might say, it's a tough market out there, and our suppliers, and our customers, and we need to negotiate this field. Well, let's not just talk about them. Let's talk about me and how individual companies are designed in ways that either leave them asking this driving extractive question or enable them to move to this generative space. And here I draw on the work of Marjorie Kelly, who wrote a fantastic book called Owning Our Future. She sets out what I think of the 5 DNA markers of corporate design. First is purpose. What's your purpose? Now, if you ask a 20th century company, what purpose? Oh, well, we want to be the biggest car company in our sector. That's a very financial, narrow purpose. Ask Open Motors, what's their purpose? Our aim is to democratize mobility. That's the purpose of the company. The toilets in Kenya, their purpose? A safe and prosperous Kenya. So companies that have a living purpose are already pointing towards this generative space. But what about how they're governed? It's all very well to have a great purpose, but how are you actually governing your company? What are the metrics by which staff are judged week on week? With the supermarkets that I worked with when I was at Oxfam, the supermarket said, we want to do ethical trade, but when you talk to the buyers, they say, well, every week I have to stand, you know, I buy the bananas and the apples and the oranges. Every week I have to tell the product manager my market share, my turnover, and my profit. Weekly. How in there is there any space for transforming to an ethical supply chain relationship? So we need new metrics by which to govern corporates that want a new purpose. Going down now in the networks, what are the relationships you have with your suppliers, with your customers, with your competitors? How are they shaping or enabling or holding back your alignment with the value that you stand for in the world? And now really going down to the deep psychological stuff. How are you owned? Whether you're owned by your own employees or owned by shareholders is going to make a huge difference, because that determines the quality of finance that comes to you. And the finance, if you're owned by the stock market, you're very likely to be drawn continually to answer to this question: how much more financial value could we extract from this? Rather than backed by finance, which is say, yes, we back you, we invest in the generative value that we know you're creating for the future. And what you have actually in the middle of all this is what I call corporate schizophrenia. And Unilever actually is a good example of a company that I admire what they're trying to do, but I think they're stuck in a moment of corporate schizophrenia, because if you listen to Paul Pullman, he speaks an incredibly generative purpose, a sustainable living plan. They even actually have the governance metrics to measure it. Cutting carbon emissions, cutting water use. So it's got real 21st century generative purpose and governance. But, of course, Unilever is still owned by the stock market and still, therefore, beholden to this financial question, which makes it no surprise that in February last year, they were open to a hostile takeover bid from Kraft 3G and Kraft Heinz and 3G, because their shareholder owners could see, well, you're doing all this generative stuff, but we could extract far more financial value from this far more quickly. So what you really need is to turn all the arrows pointing towards generative design. And then this becomes a really exciting question. In any enterprise, whether it's a small SME startup or a major global corporation, what is my purpose? What are the metrics by which we govern ourselves, and indeed the means by which the board governs us? How are we networked? How can we change our relationships with suppliers and customers to actually align ourselves with these values? Now, how are we owned? And how are we financed? And how can we find new sources of finance that are actually aligned with this vision that we hold? Because they're out there. They're emerging. The moment Triodos Bank opened its accounts in the UK, I signed up. I want to move my money. I want my money to be part of this generative future. But it's not just one bank. There are new financial networks, new financial mechanisms emerging, precisely designed to make this possible. So I think this is an incredibly exciting time, because we're seeing so many people in different parts of the economy, in different parts of enterprise, realizing that we need to redesign the institutions to enable this to happen. So let me pull back and say that I've talked about economies and companies that need to be regenerative and distributive by design. But if I put two more signposts there, I would love to hear from you what you think you would also add there in the way you run your own enterprise. Of course, it has to turn a profit, otherwise you won't survive to next year. I'm not talking about completely shifting away from that, but doing it in such a way that it's aligned with these values. But what else would you bring to the design of an enterprise that actually is going to thrive and is going to bring humanity into this safe and just space? Let me leave you with the donut, because I do believe this is the compass by which we can steer ourselves wisely and well this century. And it's the compass that might give us a chance of being judged well by our children's grandchildren, should they look back and ask themselves, how did the people at the beginning of the 21st century behave in ways that have shaped our futures? If you like these ideas and you haven't had a chance to read my book, you can save yourselves a lot of time, because I had the privilege of working with some fantastic stop-motion animators, and we made a 1-minute animation for each of the 7 ways to think like a 21st century economist set out in my book. And as you can see, they're silly, they're playful, they're irreverent, which is exactly what I think economics needs. We need to take it out of the equations, out of the ivory towers, and make it into a language that everybody can understand. Bring it out of our heads, into our hearts, into our bellies, where we can be filled with awe, but we can also laugh, and bring the economy back so that it's accessible to all, because we are all economists. We all shape the economy that we live in by moving our money, by creating a new kind of enterprise, by setting up a new legal model for enterprise, by buying different products. We are all building a critical mass of recreating the economy, which means we're incredibly powerful when we align our purpose and our values together and put our money behind our actions. Thank you very much.